in terms of the positivity, you mentioned, Hugh, earlier the issue of terrorism, the fear of terrorism. This question addresses that in part. It's a video from Bob Haas in Bribie Island, Queensland.
Jim, given your wide experience with combat veterans and also your experience with the terrorist situations, how can the government possibly risk importing in any way fighting age refugees, immigrants into our country, knowing that they can well be time bombs which could explode at any time in the future, just like our own veterans, which would have a severe impact on our own society? It's very hard to take combat out of a human. So what is the government going to do, and what would you suggest?
Jim Mullen.
Bob, thank you for that, Bob. I don't think the experience that we've had of military-aged males coming in has led to the conclusion that Bob makes. Even when we had the Paris terrorist attacks and the Brussels terrorist attacks, I think the estimates were made that of the 1 million or so people who came in that year unlawfully into Europe, only 70 or so were part of a jihadist Islamic extremist group that was bent on terrorism. So, Bob, I'm not more worried about these young men coming into Australia than I am about our own veterans. But what I would say is that I have been struck by the incongruity of a situation where we are sending our young men to Afghanistan and young Afghanistan men are coming to this country. I don't have an answer for that. But when I was in Iraq, we had something like 28 countries that were part of the coalition in Iraq, and about 3/4 of them, in fact, were countries who fought in rebellions against kings and queens and dictators in various stages of their lives. There is a principle in managing evacuees from famine, flood, fire and war, and that is that you don't move them vast distances away from the source of the problem, because when the problem's finished, it might be a good idea if they went home and rebuilt their own country. We can staff our own hospitals with good Syrian doctors, but at some stage Syria may need its doctors back. Bob, I don't have an answer any more than I have an answer for PTSD and our own soldiers. I don't think it's of the magnitude of the problem that you're suggesting, or proportionally that big a problem.
OK, there is another question related to fear in the community, and it comes from Danielle Abib.
Thank you, Tony. Recently, a person jumped over the fence of my Muslim girlfriend's house and cut the heads off her baby rabbits. She's subject to daily verbal abuse. She's spat at, she's sworn at in front of her children, all because she's Muslim. Our political setting seems to be pushing a strong anti-Muslim sentiment through polls on Muslim immigration and senators with strong anti-Muslim rhetoric. Why are pollsters allowed to ask such inflammatory questions?
Shane, I'll start with you.
Well, I think the issue is less that the pollsters are asking the questions, but that these opinions are allowed to permeate in our community. And I think you raise a really interesting point, because you've got to ask the question. We have roughly around 500,000 people in this country of the Muslim faith. And the last polls indicated that 49% of our nation, if you believe the polls, would like to see Muslims so-called banned from this country. I don't know what they're going to do with the people already here, but anyway. And the question you've got to ask is, if we've got a really tiny proportion of people in our country who are actually Muslim, how many people actually know a Muslim person and are basing their opinions on that Muslim person? And in fact, when you dig into those questions, and that's a question pollsters should have asked, you find that the people who are least likely to know personally a Muslim person have the most severe opinions in opposition to that community. So then you ask the question, how do they know what they're talking about? And you've got to look then at politics and media, because what is the fantasy that is being perpetuated to those communities about people they never know or never see? And that is the fundamental problem we've got here, because ultimately those people with a big pulpit who are able to stand up there on tabloid newspapers and politicians and say basically false things and perpetuate a completely false notion of who people are in this country and what they're doing, they're responsible for the fear generation, not the actual Muslim person in our country who barely anybody knows anyway.
A quick response to that, Jim?
I totally agree with that. I don't think the issue is that you stop asking the question. We should ask ourselves why it exists, as Danielle is asking. I think the question that was asked that 49% of people said that they agreed with was that migration from Muslim countries should be stopped. And I think that the pollster was so surprised by the 49%. I've got to say, I wasn't surprised by it. The pollster was so surprised.
Why weren't you surprised?
I've just spent the period of the election campaign on the streets of this country. All except 3 days I was out there assisting my country in my brilliant but rather short political career. And people would say to me from all sides of politics, and what did we get? We got 49% average, we got 60% of coalition people saying that they supported this, 40% of Labor and 34% of the Greens. 34% of the Greens. I find that absolutely credible because of what was put to me. I get both abused because of my involvement with Operation Sovereign Borders and thanked every day of the week. 70% of people still support it. But the point that I make...
Did you find what you were hearing on the streets at all depressing?
No, I didn't. I think I was too either cold or busy to get too depressed about anything like that. But we're looking at the wrong point. We're saying that we should stop this. 49% in a representative democracy, it would seem to me that we should take 49% of people who have views very, very seriously. We should ask why they've got them, and there is a perception that Muslims don't integrate. Shen is telling us that they do, and my lived experience is that they do. There's no two ways about it. The other one, I think, is the big one, and that's a fear of terrorism. And that ain't Pauline Hanson's fault. That is Islamic extremism, violence overseas coming into the TVs of these 49% of people who are quite concerned about it, and so we should be.
Let me quickly go...
Not the Muslims.
Jim, let me just quickly go back to our questioner for a response to that. Listening to that, did you expect a different answer, first of all?
No, I'm happy with the answer, but I'd really like to see the 49% if they actually do know a Muslim person, because I mean, you've said yourself that you don't believe that, you'll be very much in support of what Sian said, so...
OK, we'll take that as a comment. We'll move on so that we can actually get to more questions.